Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking something pretty wild, how a country's historical battles with local, old-school pollution secretly dictates how their corporations fight global climate change right now. It's like finding out the past is actually pulling the strings on our future. So let's just dive right into the data together.
Okay, let me throw a provocative question your way. Does your zip code, where you actually live, inherently decide how you're going to respond to the climate crisis? You'd probably think, hey, global problem, uniform global solution, right? Well, actually no. As you'll see, corporate behavior is deeply, deeply wired into regional history. Think back to the 1970s for a second. The whole focus of environmentalism back then was entirely on these massive, highly visible, hyper-local crises. We're talking chemical spills, toxic soil, skies choked with thick smog. You could physically see it. But today? Today, we've transitioned to tracking invisible, borderless, corporate greenhouse gas emissions. It's a massive shift in scale.
To trace how we got here, we're going to follow a quick 5-step roadmap today. We'll hit the roots of environmental policy, defining regional liability, modern corporate climate metrics, the Global Action Scorecard, and finally, who drives the change.
Starting right off with Section 1, Roots of Environmental Policy. Let's rewind to the 1960s and 70s to see where the actual foundation for modern corporate accountability was laid.
See, in the mid-20th century, environmental tragedies had very clear, obvious perpetrators. If a factory dumped chemicals into a local river, well, the community knew exactly who to point the finger at. But as environmental issues ballooned into complex, global challenges, think ozone depletion or climate change, the whole concept of liability had to adapt. You can't exactly point at one single factory and blame it for global warming, right?
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2. Defining regional liability. We need to look at how different regions historically defined who exactly takes the blame for environmental damage. Because, spoiler alert, how they solved this in the past is exactly how they approach climate policy today. Let's start with Japan. Back in the 1960s, their rapid economic growth led to some severe health crises, and that forged this concept called kogai, or public pollution. This gave victims a direct legal threat of liability to aggressively pursue specific offending corporations through fierce legal battles, like the ones fighting the devastating Minamata disease. The whole focus was locked on to that direct link between a specific company and the local damage they caused.
Meanwhile, over in the US, they took a slightly different path, leaning heavily on public nuisance and environmental justice lawsuits. This was very much a bottom-up approach, completely intertwined with the civil rights movement. You had local communities fighting tooth and nail against the unequal distribution of environmental risks. Think of the toxic Love Canal disaster or the Warren County landfill protests. It was all about citizens demanding fairness from the ground up.
Now, conversely, the European Union needed a system that could actually work across a bunch of diverse national cultures. So after the catastrophic 1976 Seveso chemical disaster in Italy, they established the polluter pays principle. This is a strict, top-down legal doctrine. Basically, it established no-fault liability. It means high-risk industries simply have to cover the costs of preventing and repairing environmental damage. Period. End of story.
Okay, moving to Section 3, Modern Corporate Climate Metrics. So, how did these deeply ingrained regional histories translate to our modern, totally borderless era of global warming? Let's take a look.
This complex web right here brilliantly illustrates the modern corporate ecosystem. Smack in the center, you've got the We Mean Business Coalition, which acts like a giant hub, connecting international frameworks like the CDP with vital global initiatives. Basically, it's the structural network that companies today use to publicly showcase their environmental commitments to the rest of the world. Now, within this ecosystem, there's honestly a bit of an alphabet soup of metrics. But the 3 key ones you really need to know that are dominating the corporate landscape today are TCFD, which is all about disclosing climate-related financial risks, SBT, which sets strict, scientifically backed greenhouse gas emissions targets, and RE100, which is exactly what it sounds like, companies committing to using 100% renewable energy. Section 4, the Global Action Scorecard. Let's see how all this history actually builds into a real-world scorecard of global corporate participation as of early 2023. This is where historical data directly meets modern strategy. Just look at the stark contrast in how companies prioritize these commitments. It's wild. Japan, for instance, absolutely leads the world in TCFD disclosures, with over 1,200 companies, but they trail the EU pretty significantly when it comes to science-based targets.
The EU, on the flip side, boasts a massive 2,560 companies committed to SBTs. They clearly prefer those deep structural emissions goals.
If we zoom in on Japan for a second, look at this explosive growth in TCFD participation right after 2019. It rockets from just 34 companies up to over 1,200. Why? Well, it's behavioral evidence of a corporate culture that really favors following the leader. Once major domestic business federations like Keidan-Ren and the government officially signaled a new direction toward carbon neutrality, Japanese corporations just moved rapidly as one giant collective.
In the US, the story is entirely different. We've seen federal policies completely flip-flop across different political administrations. I mean, from withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol to leaving and then rejoining the Paris Agreement. Yet despite all that inconsistency at the top, American corporations and local municipalities just kept consistently pushing forward with their own climate actions from the bottom up. It perfectly mirrors that historical environmental justice grassroots approach we just talked about.
Meanwhile, EU companies excel in those deep structural commitments like SBTs precisely because of strict, long-term, top-down government mandates and green deals. It's a direct echo of their historical polluter pays principle. And then there's China, where corporate action is rapidly accelerating strictly under the direct, centralized guidance of the state. It's driven by massive national emissions trading markets and hard targets to peak carbon by 2030.
Finally, Section 5. Who drives the change? The absolutely crucial point here is figuring out exactly which stakeholders are pulling the levers of change in each of these regions. Let's quickly summarize who is actually in the driver's seat.
When we map out whether the government, local municipalities, corporations, or everyday citizens act as the primary engine for progress, the core differences in regional leadership dynamics become crystal clear.
To summarize what we found, we're looking at a fascinating spectrum. The EU relies heavily on government orchestration to set the rules. The US, they rely on decentralized corporate and civic action to step in and fill those federal voids. China leans entirely on absolute, centralized state mandates. And Japan relies heavily on collective peer alignment and responding to international trends.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. As global standards like TCFD and SBT continue to unify the corporate rulebook all over the world, will they eventually overwrite these deeply ingrained regional behaviors, or will the ghosts of our environmental past, from local smog to public nuisance lawsuits, always dictate how we fight for our climate future? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep looking at the data.